All right, so just for the amount of time and since it's so nice out, Pat will be joining us here. He's having some technical difficulties, but I don't have any public, so why don't we go ahead and get this started? Oh, I do have one. That's good. Okay, one to start.
Have you admitted the public?
I have admitted the public, so
Okay, so it's
right.
my job to call the committee meeting to order as the chair of the Public Service Committee for Grosse Pointe Park. And our first order of business will be, the three members of the committee are in attendance, which includes myself, Mayor Denner, as well as Councilmember McConnell and Councilmember Fluitt. And the first item of business is public comment related to our agenda. And I'm not sure if we have any public comment or not. City Manager?
Thank you, Mayor Denner. I have no public comment so far.
Okay, with that, we'll close the public comment session and move on to the meat of the agenda, which is we really have one topic to focus on, which is the Drinking Water Revolving Fund and our plans and strategy in Grosse Pointe Park for taking advantage of that in order to upgrade our underground infrastructure. And with that, I'll turn it over to the administration to brief us. And please let us know if you'd like us to hold questions, ask questions, have discussions in the middle. Give us guidance as a committee of how you'd like to do this most effectively.
Okay, well, thank you, Mayor Denner. So this is something that I'm particularly proud of, working with OHM advisors. In my short tenure as city manager, we've certainly been looking to upgrade our infrastructure, within Grosse Pointe Park. And so working with OHM, they've really helped us establish a good method for updating, when it comes to road repair, water, sewer, reviewing our pump station. And one of the items before you tonight is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. This is something that Patrick Droz and Krista and their team have been, they have a lot of experience working with other municipalities in regards to this fund. Something that we did identify was a project that we were interested in about a year or two ago from Stantec, who was our former engineer. And so OHM went ahead and updated a little bit of that, reviewed the entire system, through their asset management plan and other areas. And so with that said, I will let the professionals go ahead. And Patrick, if you want to take it away, and Krista, floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Nick. As Nick mentioned, we will take some time today to go through a presentation that works to give an overview of what has gone into the preparation of this drinking water revolving fund application. As Nick has mentioned, this is a program through the state of Michigan. It is a competitive program that offers low interest funding for water system improvements. And so that can include a number of things based on the community's need. With Grosse Pointe Park, the needs are pretty much aligned with lead service lines, aging infrastructure, and then water meters. So we'll talk about that in a little more detail. But before we go into that, we'll also give more of an overview of a strategy for asset management. And we'll talk about some examples of how we do that currently within the city, and then how that is in turn applied to the water system, because it's done a little differently for different types of assets. We'll then go into an overview of the actual project plan that's prepared. This will be reviewed by the public. It's currently available on the city's website. It'll culminate in a public hearing at the end of this month, where we will receive any particular comments regarding that. We'll respond to that, and then there will be next phases relative to applying with the state of Michigan.
Patrick, could I interrupt you just for one brief
Absolutely.
second, and that's to build on the statement you just made about a public hearing at the end of the month for those in attendance. And of course, the council members understand this, but we do have a special meeting of council scheduled for June 28th, which will be the public hearing that you just referred to. Correct?
Correct. Yep.
And also give a chance for council to weigh in as well. Darcy?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, of course, you know what I'm probably going to say, just to make sure that we can cast a wide as net as possible to inform people about the hearing. So the usual vehicles, I don't know if there's a chance to get the communicator out before then, or but if not, maybe we can use Nixle website, social media, just to make sure. And of course, the old school printout flyers and put them in public spaces, so that we just make sure that, because this is a pretty significant project that will cause, you know, a lot of interruption, and I don't want people to come back and say we didn't know anything about it. You know, when was this hearing? I just want us to be as proactive as possible.
And one of those things, Councilmember McConnell, that I'm prepared to do this week with the Grosse Pointe News is have an article kind of stating, you know, pretty much about our meeting tonight and, you know, further what will be as part of the public hearing. But obviously, we're going to be advertising. We do have it on a city website, but we can certainly issue that out through our city email, Facebook, and we can find some other methods. But I appreciate that, and we will definitely look to do so.
And then, I'm sorry, just to follow up, the water bills, have they gone out yet? Because we could always, that's a vehicle that everyone gets. And
I think we're between billing cycles.
Yeah, we're between billing right now.
Okay, just a thought.
Okay, sorry, Patrick. I think back to you.
Not a problem. So after we go over the preparation of the revolving plan, project plan document, we will do a little bit of a deeper dive into what's recommended in that in terms of where would work occur, what is the scope of work, what would it look like for residents and businesses that might be impacted. We will have an overview of what the impact would be from a forecast perspective on water rates. And then we'll talk about the process. Again, as mentioned, there will be a council hearing at the end of this month. There's a few next steps that go after that. So we'll just provide an overview and then give just more insight into what options and strategies are available as we go into that grant period. Of course, we'll have time for question and answers. We are absolutely fine taking questions as they come up. So if you have a question, feel free to interrupt both Krista and I. Would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Any questions before we get into the presentation? Okay, hearing none, we'll get started. So when we talk about the water system as a whole, you know, as you kind of mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, Mayor, you know, people don't talk a lot about water mains and sewers, and the reality is it's buried infrastructure. It's been there for a long time, and unfortunately, with infrastructure like that, it doesn't really get into people's minds until something happens with the water main break or a sewer collapse, that type of thing. But in our case, with the city of Grosse Pointe Park, we have a few drivers about why it's the time to start looking at that. One thing is just the age of the infrastructure. Throughout the city, there is a very high percentage of the pipes in the ground that are original. So this goes back to the 1920s in many cases. And although things were built very well back then, kind of the accepted life cycle for water main that's cast iron of that vintage is around 100 years or less. So we're starting to get into the point where the breaks may become more frequent and become more impactful as those happen. The other part of that is our water meters. We have old water meters, and what happens with those typically is as they do age, they become less accurate and they become more difficult to maintain. So water meters has been something that the city DPW has identified for a long time as something that's of interest. The other changes we'll talk about is lead and copper rule. We'll get into that with a little great level of detail. And then just the strategy of managing our assets through asset management. The state of Michigan has really looked to municipalities to use that methodology for managing all assets. And so there's been incremental changes to when those are required. And it started with roads. then it went to sewers and then water. So it's becoming part of how you actually must maintain to get permits through the state. So that's just a program that the city is adopting as part of their management of the existing system. So looking at our aging infrastructure, as I mentioned, our mains in general are really approaching the end of their design life. Most are getting near 100 years old. And what we're starting to find is that there's an increasing number of breaks. And so this is an average breaks per year that we're seeing. And so this is data that's collected by DPW. And as you can see over the last 15 years or so, that rate has started to go up. And so that can mean different things. Water main breaks can happen in somebody's front lawn. They can also happen on Mack Avenue. Those can mean different things in terms of costs and impacts to businesses. But the reality is that the number in general is going up, and it's what we would expect as mains do get older. And so that's especially the case because in most cases, once we get to that 100-year mark, we're really at the end of the useful service life. And the same with, as we mentioned with the meters, that those are also in disrepair and harder to maintain just because parts are not available for some of the meters that are still in the system. On lead and copper, we're all aware of the changes to the rules on lead and copper. And it was brought to the forefront, of course, by the Flint water crisis years ago. But what it's resulted in is that the state of Michigan now has kind of the leading edge of what's required for water quality relative to lead. And so the state of Michigan, with its changes to lead and copper rule, have reduced the action level to 12 micrograms per liter. And what that says is that if you have samples that are done, there's a very rigorous methodology for how samples are taken at homes throughout the city. And you're looking at actual taps. You collect the samples at those locations and you get those analyzed and report those to the state of Michigan. If you're above that level of 12 micrograms per liter, the state will require that action is taken immediately to deal with that. The good news is that the city of Grosse Pointe Park receives its water through the Great Lakes Water Authority. We have 3 separate connections. And the Great Lakes Water Authority does all the treatment of the water and also puts in additives to prevent corrosion. And with that in the case, even if there are pipes that might have lead in them, certainly old brass fittings can have them, the corrosion protection that's put in to the water prevents that leaching of the lead. And so as a result, the values that the city of Grosse Pointe Park sees on this annual testing are below the action level. So there's really no concern right now with the water quality. The water quality across the city is well within the quality parameters set by EGLE, which is the Department of Energy Great Lakes, Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, which is the former MDEQ, if you're familiar with that acronym. The state of Michigan has also required that communities take time to figure out what is the makeup of this system. So there's been effort by the city DPW to review records and determine the number of lead service lines within the city. So there are a total of 4,225 service lines. And when I say service line, that is the line that comes out from the meter in your house and connects to the public water main in the street. And so we have over 4,000 of those. And nearly half of those are believed to have some form of lead service line. And what that means is that can mean that there's just a small portion of it. It could mean there is the entire pipe itself is made of lead material. The state of Michigan does not differentiate. If there's any portion of that service between the water main in the street and your home, it is termed as a lead service. So we are aware of at least 2,000, at least 2,000 of those. And what the state of Michigan is going to require is that the communities work to address 5% per year. So basically beginning in 2025, there will be a requirement that cities have a plan in place to deal with the lead service lines. And it averages out again to about 5% per year. And so roughly that's about 100 services that would have to be taken care of.
Patrick, can I ask you a
Sure.
technical question at this point about the definition of the service line? You indicated it's the line between the house and the main, which I understand. Somewhere between the house and the main, pretty close to the main, is typically what I refer to as a curb stop.
Yep.
The valve that can be turned on and off. Does a service line include when we talk about service lines and the probability of lead all the way to the main itself, or just to the curb stop?
So the service line itself refers from the main all the way to the house. So it includes that curb stop. There's actually been a bit of I will call it spirited debate amongst the utilities, especially in Southeast Michigan, about who actually owns the main, excuse me, the service line between that curb stop, as you mentioned, which typically is at the sidewalk, and the house. Traditionally, that's been determined to be private infrastructure, but it's basically been agreed to at this point that municipalities are responsible all the way from the meter to the water main. So that includes that curb stop, that whole route.
Yeah, I understand that. In fact, that is a change in what you just described is actually a very important feature of this going forward. As private infrastructure, anything we do on a service line would be billed to that individual customer. But as public infrastructure, the cost of anything we do to that service line is borne by the entire municipality. So it's an important distinction in terms of ownership in that. But I also wonder, and you can talk about this later as we talk about replacing service lines, does that include all the way to the main beyond the curb stop or just to the curb stop, that sort of thing? Okay,
Yep.
continue. I'm sorry.
Very good. Next few slides are really just kind of a bit of an overview about how we currently use asset management in the city of Grosse Pointe Park. And probably the most prominent way that we use it every year is for pavement management. So the city of Grosse Pointe Park and OHM take time every few years to go and drive every mile of road within the city. And so we do that to assess current pavement conditions and really evaluate not only the current condition, but what we forecast to happen based on basically a series of data points that we start to collect year to year. And we use that to really kind of identify where are the needs in the system. For instance, on this PACER map here, anything you see in green is what we term good. So those are, basically roads that we've repaved in the last 3 or 4 years typically. As you go down that scale to the red road segments, those are ones that are in very much deficient condition, requiring typically a little more heavy maintenance. Multiple lift, mill, and overlays. As a matter of fact, this is the map before we did the work last year. So you can see that St. Paul Street is pretty much red almost end to end. So that was one of the streets that was addressed, as well as Essex. So this is kind of a strategy that's used, again, every year. There's a limited amount of funds available. So we want to be putting those to the roads that really need it the most. And so that's basically the strategy of asset management. But it's also a little bit more of, and I'll show you the next few slides about what you actually do to those particular segments with maintenance. As I mentioned, asset management has become more of a requirement, not only just from best practices, but also relative to permit obligations. So in 2018, water systems were required to comply with that, as well as wastewater systems. Now the city itself is nested within the GLWA system. So we don't have an NPDES permit specifically for the city, but it had you, for instance, if you had your own treatment plant, you would have to comply with that, with asset management for your whole system. This is just an example. We're basically showing that it's many times more efficient to do preventative maintenance early on versus waiting it to the point where it goes to total failure and you have to basically make a larger investment. So generally, this example kind of shows if you just kind of let everything go to full decay and then do large interventions, in this particular example, you're going to spend more money maintaining the same average. Actually, this is a slightly less average rating. In this, for instance, in this example, over the 36-year lifespan, we spend $3.30 per square yard per year, and the average rating is a 6. we can spend a little bit less and do it more in a preventative nature, where we do, on a pavement example, we might do crack sealing, and then we do a really small overlay, and then we do a more rigorous overlay 20 years down the road. So we might do smaller interventions spread out over time. We have a better overall condition, we spend less on it. So that's kind of the whole perspective on asset management, is that we try to maintain our system. We work on the priority assets at the right time. So with water, it looks a little bit different in terms of how we manage that. And so we really rely on the asset management plan, which Nick has mentioned. That document is an appendix within the project plan. If you care to kind of understand the details of that, it really talks about how various segments of water main or areas of the city have been identified as priority. And it really kind of looks at things that we have based on the data of the main. So we look at how big is the main, the water main size really has kind of changed. There are some instances in the city where we have smaller diameter mains, might be 6-inch mains. Typically now we kind of require that everything is 8-inch or larger. The smaller mains have potentially less pressure. They can provide sometimes less fire suppression. So those are identifying properties of mains that might need replacement. We also really look at some of the business risks of the mains. So to I guess put it, plainly, a break on a residential street may have an impact to residents. They may have, potentially maybe a loss of a driveway temporarily, some street flooding. That might be a different scenario if it plays out on Mack Avenue, where you have more paved surfaces. Those mains are more expensive to break. They could potentially impact critical businesses, doctor's offices, things like that. So those are other parameters that are used in the business risk evaluation. We also look at the probability of the failure. So the main contributors to that are the age of the main, as well as the break history and the material. We know that the material is pretty consistent, and as is the age. So the main thing that really drives our risk factors and business risk in the city of Grosse Pointe Park is that break history. So we'll show you that in a few minutes here as well. So ultimately, all that analysis eventually goes into developing a project plan, which we'll show you in a little bit. We try to also review that against the water rates. So there are a lot of needs. We want to also balance that with the fact that we need to be cognizant of what that is going to do in terms of a rate increase, because there's obviously a cost to that work, and how do we spread that out over time for the community. This is just kind of a high-level review. We'll show these with a little greater detail later, but you can kind of see these highlighted areas here. These are the priority areas, which we will document a little more later in our presentation. But the small X's that you see throughout here are the main breaks. So that's one of the things, along with the apparent condition, that we'll use to help elevate where projects need to happen. The other component of that, of course, is the lead service lines. So we also have that information that we use to help identify where those potential projects might land. Before we go into the DWRF section, any questions about that last discussion? Okay.
I just have a quick clarifying question from residents, sort of follow up on what the mayor was saying. When we talk about lead service line replacement, is it all exterior, or is it both exterior and interior?
So typically the way that the rules are written is that it is, call it 95% exterior, but we will typically come into the house, into the meter, and the typical measurement is, they say, no more than 36 inches inside the house, and that typically gets you to the meter. So there could still be piping on the resident side within the house, but the guidance from Eagle says basically to the meter or 36 inches, whatever is shorter.
That's somewhat analogous to what DTE has done with the gas mains or with gas service lines.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
Sure.
also typically with a lot of those houses, those service lines, and some of the service lines do come in different spots, especially with finished basements. So you have a lot of that too. So if you got a finished basement, you may have to go from probably access a different spot in the basement. I mean, with directional boring, you just, a lot of times you can do it right at the front wall, or a lot of times they'll have to go underneath and maybe go 5 to 10 feet inside the house itself. Underneath, of course.
With that, Krista, do you want to take the next few slides?
Sure. Okay. So the DWRS-RF loan program, that stands for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, has a federal component, and then there's also a state match of 20%. So that means that the state of Michigan adds 20% to what the federal government is providing. There tend to be lower interest rates. For 2021, they are 1.875%, and they could be 2.125% depending on the length of the loan. So for a 20-year loan, it's a little bit lower. With the 30-year loan, it's a little bit higher. And this year they have about 250 to, I think I've seen it increase a little bit to $275 million available to give out for fiscal year 2022 projects, which are the project plans that are being submitted by this July 1st. And in order to be considered, the project plan needs to be prepared, which has already been done, and then a public hearing needs to be held. And then Eagle scores the projects and ranks them based on the scores, and then a cutoff of the money they have available identifies the fundable range. So Eagle has already.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt and ask a question?
Sure.
When you said the score determines the fundable range, does that mean the score determines which communities receive funding, or which are the amount that is eligible to be received by each of those communities? So what I'm asking is, would a community be excluded, or would it just determine the amount that they can receive?
It is an exclusion. So they look at the population of the community and they assign a certain amount of points. They look at whether it's addressing water quality problems and they give it a certain amount of points. You get points for working on the distribution system. They also give points for pump stations and storage tanks and some other areas, but they look at the scores and then they rank the projects. So if you are in the fundable range, then you meet the requirements of the public hearing and the project plan, then you are eligible for funding. If you are below the line, then that year you are not eligible for funding.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So the previous few years, Eagles had sufficient money to give everyone who has applied. This year, because they said they would have a lot of money, and also because of the possible additional infrastructure money that may or may not come out of Washington, which Eagle has implied might be distributed through the SRF program. There are a lot more applicants than there have been recently. So Eagle has already looked at the intent to apply forms that were submitted. The before the end of January, and done a preliminary score for each of the communities that they received an intent to apply for. This is not the final list because some of those communities may decide not to submit a project plan, or I suppose they may be disqualified for one reason or another, but that's pretty rare if they go through the trouble of preparing the project plan. Usually they meet the public hearing requirements and things, but and I guess I kind of jumped the gun a little bit here as far as what the scoring depends on, but if there's an issue with the water being supplied, there's points for that. There's points for treatment, distribution, the storage pumping, and that can lead to lower scores for communities that are served by GLWA because you don't have the treatment component, because GLWA gets to claim that. But population, depending on how many people there are, there's different ranges of scores that are granted, as well as if you are a disadvantaged community, if you have a wellhead protection plan, and consolidation, which I can't really tell you what it is, but I looked at all the scores and no one of any of the applicants were awarded consolidation points. So I don't know if that's, you have 3 communities that are near each other and they decide to form one authority and therefore you would consolidate. It's a little unclear, but.
So Krista, these preliminary scores are known, and based on your description, I'm guessing that we didn't score near the top. But are you going to share some of that with us tonight?
I sent them to Patrick. I don't know if he can pull them up, or we can share them later, or we can do it now. And
No, I'm just curious. Based on your experience and looking at the preliminary scores, are we even in the running?
you're pretty low down the list.
Part of it, I think, depends on, as was mentioned by Krista, who is part of the final submittal. So that was basically Eagle. When we looked at this program back in December, had every community complete a form and basically report, what is your project, what is the anticipated funding, and then all the parameters that Krista mentioned. Are you under a consent order? Are you dealing with a wellhead issue? What's your population, et cetera? And I think we got that, basically that scoring list May 27th that showed, as Krista mentioned, a lot of communities on the GLWA system were outside of that fundable range. I would say we're kind of probably in that back 3/4 of the list. A lot of communities with their own water supplies and disadvantaged communities typically were in those upper ranges. So that being said, there's still, I think, a lot of value in the project plan in terms of identifying the needs. And as was mentioned, if additional funds are made available, and to use the prior stimulus as an example back in 2008 timeframe, the list was basically considered the shovel-ready projects. And so in many cases, the federal dollars were funneled through these programs. And oftentimes, at least back in the 2008 timeframe, many of the projects were basically set up with principal forgiveness. So not only was the federal program used as a way to administer the project, but portions of the project were paid for at 100% level by the federal government. So again, not knowing exactly what's going to happen with the infrastructure bill in Washington, this could be a program where that is used as the point to fund the projects.
I don't know if I'm getting ahead of you, but do you have a cost for the upgrades as well as the lead pipe replacement?
Yes.
Okay.
We'll definitely cover that the next dozen slides or so.
We also, at this point, don't know who is going to submit a plan and who may choose not to, because there were many communities that said, sure, I will intend to apply because otherwise I can't do it. And then decided, as they looked at things closer, they decided not to apply. So it's certainly not a final list.
Clearly, it takes a lot of effort to apply, which we have done. So that you're right. I'm sure that there are a number of communities that dropped out or will.
And Krista, I believe you can apply in subsequent years too. You know, if you
Correct.
don't
They
make the
can
range.
hold those plans, and from my understanding, the original plan before there was talk of an infrastructure bill was that the funding level for the drinking water SRF would remain high. Previous years only funded $50 to $75 million in projects, but Eagle had indicated that they were planning to stay at close to the 200 to $250 million range of fundable projects again next year. And again, if this infrastructure bill comes forward, there may be additional money. Did you want me to continue? Or
Sure,
you
I
want to
can keep this. I can do this one. Yep. So now going to the point of what are our needs within the system, and this is actually a photo that that Pat had shared with me earlier. This is an example of an existing 6-inch water main in one of your neighboring communities, very recent. This can kind of show kind of what happens to some of these older mains over time. This is actually a 6-inch pipe with what we call tuberculation on the inside. These are just iron deposits that form over time. So again, our citywide needs are, there's really been not a abundance of replacement done over the last few decades. So as a result, many of the water mains in the community, greater than 50%, are rated at what we call condition 4 or 5. And those are, again, our critical mains that would need repair, as well as our water meters. And as mentioned, just due to the age of the system and our data that we do have, we know there's a fair number of lead service lines. So using all this information within our, we call GIS, we basically layer this information on top of each other, and needs begin to emerge from that analysis. And so generally speaking, some of the main recommendations are any smaller diameter mains, and generally those are ones less than 8 inches in diameter, need to be replaced. And it comes down to there is a diminished water quality, pressure is lower, the ability to provide as much flow is compromised with these smaller mains. We also recommend looping, which basically takes any dead end main. What that does is it basically just connects it to the network, and that helps with overall pressure and water quality. We also look at replacing our hydrants and valves within the community. If we go through the effort of replacing mains and the service lines, we want to make sure that the valves that we use to control the system are also still in working order. We mentioned also that the water meters would be replaced at the same time as lead services. Interestingly, if you disturb any portion of a water service doing any repairs, there are protocols that are required to be followed now relative to lead and copper rule. So even if you decided that we're just going to do meter replacement, there's still steps that are necessary to make sure that that water is safe before we turn it back on. So again, these projects make sense to layer on top of each other, because if you're already digging up an area, if you're already replacing a water service and the main itself is old, there's usually economies of scale for bundling those into projects. I'm going to go through a couple of the project areas. So generally speaking, water main replacement is part of every one of these 4 phases that we'll go over. There are slight variations about how that would get built. And the project plan basically lays out alternatives for how we can do that. And so there's what we call open cut construction, which is what you might assume. It's basically an excavator digging down a trench about 5 feet deep, putting a new pipe in the ground, and then connecting water services to that pipe, backfilling, and then restoring any of the impacted areas. The other method that we looked at was what we call a trenchless installation, which is similar to what DTE was doing with the new service lines or new gas mains being put in through the city, where we identify locations where the new pipe can be pulled into place, and then try to limit the number of excavations that we make. As you know, even with that, there are still impacts. Of course, the sidewalks and driveways get impacted, but we try to work in those greenbelt areas. And by using the directional drill, we can also try to limit the impact to tree roots. If we do the open cut, even if we go around the trees, sometimes there's damage that's done to the root systems that can compromise the health of trees. So the directional methods of installation are preferred, especially with so many very mature and well-maintained trees in the community. This phase 1 area, which I'll show you in a second.
Patrick, can I ask you another kind of, I guess it's a technical question.
Absolutely.
When we go to replace a main, where are our mains primarily? Are they, if you take the easement area from sidewalk across the street into the other sidewalk, where are our mains typically on our residential streets?
And Pat, you can correct me if I'm off on this, but typically they're opposite side from the gas main, and they would generally be located behind the back of curb and the sidewalk, so kind of in that margin area. And it does vary from street to street, but typically they're not under the road. They're really in that grass area between sidewalk and the curb.
Okay, good. That's what I thought, but I wanted to hear that because it does have an impact on what sort of disruption we can expect.
Yep. Yeah, and actually one of the things that we looked at initially was, would there be an option where it would make sense to do that in the street? The reality is that gets very expensive just because of the amount of pavement that you have to put back. The city typically has asphalt streets, but there's usually a concrete base under that. So that is it's a great cross section from a road perspective. It makes it very efficient to do mill and overlay year after year. But if you dig it up, it gets expensive.
Yeah,
I
I can confirm that asking anybody. I'm sure Pat can as well. Thinking back to the sewer separation project, which went down right down the center of the streets with an open cut. It was extraordinarily disruptive, and it took years before you could really restore the smooth integrity of our streets.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if folks can see on my screen the GIS viewer, but this is just an example. Typically that our storm sewers are down the middle of the road, as Mayor Denner was saying, and our water mains will often be kind of in that greenbelt area. Sanitary sewer, in many areas of the community, is in the rear yard area. So the water main itself often would be either located in the same area, or we might even switch to the other side of the road if there's a corridor. And that can vary from street to street, but generally speaking, we find it's most cost effective to try to focus that main somewhere in that greenbelt area. Now, interesting about phase 1, we have a photo here on MAC. Phase 1 really works north from Jefferson and Weyburn in Maryland, but then we also have MAC identified. As we mentioned earlier, one of the things that we look at is, again, the presence of breaks. So you can see there's a number of breaks in this particular area, but we also have the consequence of failure. So if a main does fail on MAC, it's an impact to businesses. Those are generally more expensive because we have to restore roadways and sidewalks, and even there's potential for property damage depending where it happens. So this was identified as a high priority project area, again, kind of all because of all those factors. advisors. And this would be our phase 1 project. There's 4 phases that we talk about. We kind of envision that this would be potentially a 4-year type project that we would do phase per year, just to kind of control where the work is happening, and make sure that we can kind of keep contractors contained year after year. Phase 2 is very similar. Again, we're looking in this case on Lake Point, Beaconsfield, Nottingham, as well as Somerset and Balfour. And I'll show you again the similar map on the next slide. We'll be doing the same with the trenchless installation, and about 400 lead service lines in this particular area. We've recorded about 10 breaks since 2005 in this area. So in this particular example here, again, here's our greenbelt area. The main itself could go somewhere in here. It could actually go into the sidewalk. We would identify based on what other utilities are in the area, what makes the most sense from a cost effectiveness standpoint. Again, here's our limits for this particular phase. You can see there is a concentration of breaks in this area. And again, the presence of lead service lines help to elevate this particular project as a recommended focus area. And again, this is phase 2. Phase 3, this time we would be looking at Bishop, Drayton, Harvard, Cadju. And those are generally from Jefferson to Mac, as well as Yorkshire between Kirchville and Mac. Difference here, a little bit longer. We have the 20,000 feet of water main, slightly less lead services, about 250 than phase 1 as a comparison. And the issue here is that we've had a higher number of breaks in this particular area. So again, this is our limits here. We'd just be doing main replacement. The section on Cadju would be on the west side of the street, obviously. And this again is phase 3, which should again be probably the 3rd year if we were to roll these out over a year program. Phase 4, we'd be looking at Lake Point, Beaconsfield, Nottingham between Jefferson, as well as Balfour from Wimble Point to Essex, Cromley and Harcourt between Wimble Point and Jefferson, and Bedford from Essex to Jefferson. 22,000 feet of water main, about 125 lead services, so slightly less services in this area, and about 34 breaks since 2005. See, this is a little more cut up, again, based on presence of breaks. For instance, on Balfour, we do place a little more importance on some of the more recent breaks too, especially if we start to see them pop up with more frequency. You can see, particularly over here on Bedford, there's quite a few breaks in this particular area. So this is, again, kind of some of the background about why these particular areas are noted. But this would be that phase 4, which would be the 4th year of the program. So there's a question about cost and what does that potentially mean from an impact statement for the homeowners in the area. The project costs, and these are estimates based on using unit prices. So we will look at projects in other communities that are using similar materials. And we also look at trends in contract pricing. And so we use that to determine what we estimate a cost to be for a given project. So in total, if you add all these projects up, it would work out to about $27 million worth of infrastructure investment. And as Krista had mentioned, there's kind of a 20-year and a 30-year loan period. And then just to kind of show how that would impact, if there was no other adjustments to rates on a bi-monthly bill, those rates could change up to $66 for the bill or $49 for the 30-year term if that was used. So either one could be used. Obviously, there's just some differences with the interest rates on those, and again, how long the payback period is on those. So those are not insignificant amounts. We would certainly acknowledge that it's an impact for sure. But it does take a very significant impact to the lead services that as mentioned, they will be required to be replaced within 20 years. So what this does, it, in addition to the mains themselves, we knock out about 60% of the services within a 5-year period. So in many ways, you're getting ahead of things. Where you really have 20 years to do that, you'll be at 60% completion of lead service renewal within the first 5 years. So that makes the burden of doing the renewals for the remainder of the system something that you can spread out for a longer term.
And Patrick, just to put into perspective for the public and committee too. So if we were to look at the sewer separation that was passed by the voters, about 20 years ago that Pat Thomas worked on, the millage rate for that was 2.55. So if we were to take the average taxable value of a home, let's say $150,000 within Grosse Pointe Park, we were looking at for a sewer separation about $380 a year. So we're right around the same. If you were to average out either those 20 or 30-year costs of what the sewer separation project was for and what this project would be here. So you're looking at, potentially about $300 to $400 at our estimate right now if this full project were to go for the $27 million for a 20-year period. And that was retired in 2018, I believe, the sewer separation.
So you're saying that the average taxpayer would see an additional $300 to their property tax bill?
Per year, yes.
I think the way this is funded, though, would be through water bills as opposed to property.
Yeah, sorry, it'd be through their water bills.
And if I could just clarify, just confirm, that's not per household, that's per resident.
It's per bill, so per meter.
Okay, all right, thanks.
So on that, this is just kind of an overview of the water rates and how they're listed on the bills right now. And so typically it's a combination of charges. There are three fixed charges that are on each bill. And those include, and I actually have a small typo here, $750 a month.
I'm sorry, Patrick, can I interrupt you just for 1 second? I want to clarify my answer to Councilmember Fluid. When I said it's per meter, that's largely correct, but we have a couple of exceptions to that where we have, a single meter servicing a large number of households. So the most obvious exception to that would be the condominiums on Jefferson at Lake Point. And so when we do things that are otherwise per meter, we make an adjustment in the case of those condominiums so that it's equitable across the residences, not just if they have, I don't know how many meters they have, 1, 2, or 3, but they have many more residences. So there are a couple of exceptions, but largely it's per meter, which usually corresponds to household.
Okay, thank you.
And so on the topic of meters, and so the information on the next two slides is presented on a monthly basis. The bills right now are bi-monthly, so just bear with me for the comparison purposes of the next two slides. But generally speaking, the fixed charges are, again, the sewer charge, which is right now on your bill itself, it is you would probably see it come across as $66.90 divided in half. It's $33.45. Fixed charge from GLWA to provide water, about $30.67 a month. And you can, excuse me, $30.67 a month. And a capital cost, which is a fixed item, that would be, again, equated to the month, $3.75. The other component of that, which is more variable, is your consumption. So if you, are using water to, say, water your lawn or fill up a swimming pool or fill the backyard ice rink or whatever, that's obviously going to affect how much you pay in that given month versus if you are maybe on vacation and only there a couple days the year. The meters themselves obviously monitor how much water you use, and it's multiplied by that rate of $3.80 per 100 cubic feet of water. And again, your bills themselves are bi-monthly. So I basically divided everything in half just to show a comparison. So what we did is we reached out to looking at some of the communities in the area, just as kind of an example. And this is not a formal rate study by any means, but this is just really reviewing data on community websites and their information. On a monthly basis, typical water bill for somebody that uses 10 cubic feet of water, 10 units of water per month, about $105. In other communities, you can kind of see that spread. It goes all the way as low as, say, $76 in Plymouth to, for example, of $138 in Northville. And just for a comparison, those are communities that are right next to each other. So what goes into a water bill, has other factors to it. There's obviously the charges that GLWA passes on to you, but then there might be projects that communities are paying debt service on, as an example. So again, if we were to add in that roughly $33 a month to the bill, it does push you higher. It would definitely push you to the higher end of things from a rate perspective, but not totally out of whack with some of the the ones that are in the higher portion. So again, every community is different, and this is just again based on simply taking the current rate right now and then applying what that projected increase would be by taking the project cost and basically dividing it out by the number of meters in the community. And it would be basically the suggestion that anybody with an account would pay for that, for the cost of the program, much like you do right now with the capital program. There's this particular capital cost item that's on there. And within the project plan, there is a section of that report that goes into greater detail about this, with again the interest rate, the number of accounts. So if there's questions about how that particular cost was calculated, there's some additional information there on that item. Any questions about that rate discussion? Okay. Krista, do you want to touch on these next steps for the project plan?
Sure. So the public notice for the public hearing was published in the Grosse Pointe News on May 27th. We do need an affidavit from Grosse Pointe News showing that it was published. We do need to include that as in the appendix to the final project plan. The public hearing is scheduled for June 28th, 2021, which is a Monday. That, again, as part of the project plan requirements, we need to provide a recording of that public hearing. We need to provide that link to Eagle, and then Eagle will look to see which of the project plans they actually did receive and adjust their project priority list, possibly rescore some of the projects based on the details that are provided, as the intent to apply form is pretty general. And then they would usually public notice that list in mid-August, and then they need to hold a public hearing on the list for people to make comments on. And that usually happens in September or October before it is finalized. There are, for the projects that are within the fundable range, depending on you're able to request which quarter you would like funding in. So then they have various deadlines that need to be met. So the draft documents would need to be submitted in November. Final design documents in mid-January. A rate methodology would need to be developed and approved to show how you would repay the money from the loan. Based on the information provided in the project plan and additional information that Eagle develops, they have to have an environmental assessment published, as well as there's various applications that need to be completed by the applicants. And then they need to get submitted to Eagle in mid-February. The finding of no significant impacts is required. That is something that Eagle develops. And then the plans and specs are approved so that bidding can occur in early March. Once the bids have been tentatively awarded, mid-April, followed by the order to approve. And then there's a pre-closing meeting for financing with final closing in early June and construction able to proceed in August. I think this is based on a third quarter funding schedule. And then we'd have approximately 5 years or 4 years from there to complete the construction of the projects.
And this just, again, to provide kind of a view of what the next steps are. You know, the immediate action of having that public hearing on the 28th and then submitting to Eagle really gives a lot of definition about, you know, which strategy you go with. Ultimately, that final scoring will be the identifying information about whether this particular program, the SRF program, can be used. Certainly, as we mentioned, it's something you can reapply for. You can take this application and put it back in the hopper and potentially make some, if there's are any comments that we do get from Eagle, we can make those adjustments. But then once you've decided to proceed with it, it does follow this very much regimented schedule, because basically what the state is doing is that every community that's part of these quarterly loan issuances with the state of Michigan is really all packaging everything together, and then the state goes out for the funding in those quarters. So having every project follow the same schedule with documents bid and turned in by these dates are critical to make sure the state can proceed on that. And then once that loan has been secured, the city itself can begin the projects, and really it's just a pattern of you know, working with the contractor, getting pay estimates from the contractor, and then submitting invoices for reimbursement from the state using that, basically because the state holds the funds in reserve for these projects.
Okay, so can I just clarify, the final scoring is when?
That will be public noticed in mid-April.
Oh, so we're talking next year.
Or sorry, mid-August. Sorry, wrong A month. But
Okay.
mid-August, and then it'll be,
Mid-August this year,
Yep.
right?
yeah, and then it'll be finalized after the public hearing. They'll have like 30 days after the public hearing to take into consideration any comments received and publish the follow list.
And you're
There's
saying-
also a key thing that component of the public hearing, as I understand it, and you can confirm this, that the city council needs to approve a resolution to proceed, and that's an important part of the application process. So it's not just a public hearing and we go. Council has to pass a resolution to agree to apply for this program.
Gotcha. And so just to follow up on that, you will seem to say that it's not looking good for us to receive this. If you had to handicap it, I mean, what are our odds?
I think it really comes down to who submits. You know, I think it's really hard to say. I mean, had this been the year prior, we we would have been fine, but because there were so many projects submitted, it really stretches that out, so many of the GLWA communities find themselves towards the back end of it, which, I think from our perspective, we know the needs there. We know that the requirements are going to be coming very quickly from Eagle with regard to lead service lines. So it may make sense to submit and see where we fall. And then at that point in time, start having conversations with folks in the legislature about the need for additional funding for this requirement. And so, certainly, whether it's through the federal government or the state government, any sort of additional outside sources to help fund this will be helpful. You could also do local, depending on the city's bond rating. There are many communities find that these are easier to do locally because there's a few less strings attached relative to the environmental clearance perspective. We don't have a significant concern with that in the city of Grosse Pointe Park, but probably the biggest clearance item comes down to historic preservation. Certainly the streetscapes, many historic buildings within the city. That is definitely something that is part of a federal program that we have to basically make sure that we're following all the proper channels regard to historic preservation and what we call Section 106 compliance.
Yeah, from my point of view, and if you just step back, the first part of this discussion was really about the need and a project plan, right? I don't believe that there's any question that over some period of time for the future of our city. It's a definite need. It's something we've got to address. Then the question becomes, over what period of time do we do it? How quickly do we try to do it? And how do we pay for it? Because the state has this financing option available, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to try to take advantage of this financing option because of the interest rates that are offered, and it gives us an opportunity to truly accelerate improving the infrastructure for our residents, for our community. As Patrick indicated, if we do not participate in this program, either because we decide not to or because we don't make the cut, or we don't make the cut soon enough to satisfy our need to proceed, then we have to find another way. And there's the drip, drip, drip approach, which essentially is the same dollars over 20 or 30 years. It just takes a whole lot longer to accomplish some of the things that are in this. The other approach would be a bonding approach, which is similar to what was taken in the sewer separation, where again we get the money up front, we execute the project plan, and again pay for it over a long period of time. So if the first key question is, should we take it on quickly and then pay for it over a long period of time, which I think makes sense given the age of our infrastructure. The longer we delay, the bigger the problem is for Grosse Pointe Park. And then I see two major funding paths, this revolving fund, or at some point, if we decide this isn't going to be feasible, we'll have to come to grips with a bond, which would be similar in scale, similar in size, and similar in cost. To put it in perspective, I think we all know that the bond that was just sold, now bond rates can change all the time, obviously. The bond that was just sold to construct our new DPW was, I think,
194.
Thank you, Nick. 1.94 in interest rates, which puts it kind of in the middle of this range. How many years was the DPW loan, just to confirm? I think that's a 20.
That's
I
20.
think it's 15. Is
20 or
it?
25.
I thought it was 15.
No, you know what? Councilmember Fluid's right. It's 15.
No. Oh, it is 15. Okay, so it's 15. And thank you. So whether or not we could beat this interest rate in the open market is probably questionable. More than likely, this will offer the best financing cost, although as Patrick pointed out, there is some overhead associated with participating in any state and federal program. On the other hand, it gives you kind of a surety of rate and a source of funds. So, you know, it's a tough decision in some ways for the city, and we're going to ask council to consider at least the first step, and that is to apply for the revolving fund after the public hearing on the 28th. If we don't make the cut, then I think that the conversation then moves to the administration and our engineers continuing to do some analysis. And then at that point, council would have to decide if you want to, you know, try again next year, do a little bit as necessary, or proceed on a bonding strategy. I've thought a lot about this over the years, and I was unwilling to take on this kind of an annual burden for our residents until we got sewer separation paid for. That was a fairly significant burden on the city, which obviously had great benefit. It was a big burden on the cash flow of the city. With that off the books starting in 18, that helped us. Realistically, though, we have put some things back on more on the books, and that the residents did approve millages for our roads and public safety. I would say that as much as anything, that was to compensate for the unusual way that municipalities get financed in the state of Michigan because of headly and property limitations. So that's my little speech on this, but that is the decision that the city is going to be faced with at some point. And the first step is to pursue this revolving fund. Now, the other question I have for Patrick and Krista is, assume we go forward, let's assume that we move forward on the 28th after the hearing and council agrees on the resolution to proceed in the application. Is that cast in concrete at that point? Or is there opportunities for either changing our mind before we actually get the funding, or modifying the project plan at some point over the next, I think it's close to a year before the money changes hands?
Krista, I'm not sure if you want to maybe touch on that. I think you kind of have to have your project fairly well identified by the time you turn it in.
Okay.
But maybe speak to that a little bit more, Krista.
Yeah, by passing the resolution, you are not committing the city to going forward. I think at that point you can still say, you know, we prefer not to be considered. I would say that by mid-August, when that the list of priority fundable projects is published, and if you were to be on it at that point, you would need to say, yes, we're going to go forward with it, or please take us off the list.
Yeah.
You can't do less than what you're proposing. So if you wanted to do, say, phases 1 and 2, but not proceed with phases 3 and 4, you can make that decision. You couldn't say, we'd like to replace phase 2 with a different area of the city that we did not discuss in the project plan, without submitting an amendment to the project plan. Typically, Eagle does not like to see those off cycle, so you would have to wait and submit those next July 1st.
Yeah, I would hope that we wouldn't need to do any of that, but I just wanted to get some of that understanding. So it's an important milestone for us, June 28th.
I have a question. Is is there any way that us pursuing an alternative like the bonding would allow us to be able to expedite these things? It's still a pretty long timeline. I'm just curious if we did option B that you sort of mentioned, would that allow us to do these things more quickly?
I think, local bonding will move much quicker, at least in the initial phase of things. There's still definitely some time and energy that's needed to design and permit the improvements. I think we, typically on just a typical municipal utility project, the typical time frame. So say you were to say, we want to replace water main, next summer. The process that we would typically follow on a local project, assuming you have funds in place, we would basically start on what we call design, where we go out and understand where all the utilities are, topographic surveys, request information from utilities, design, and then there's a permit phase where we basically submit the documents to Eagle to review and permit. And that typically is conservatively a 6-month process usually. So in theory, if you started today, you probably could be, doing a project in the spring of next year. This particular methodology through Dwarf has a few more steps in it on the administrative ends of things. So really that bidding that we could probably do on a local project where, we're basically bidding the project in November of this year. You can see that it pushes it out probably a good 3 to 4 months. So
Okay.
it's not a exorbitant amount of time in the schedule, but the other part of it is really just kind of waiting for the funding to come around. So where if you have the funds locally already, and you bid the project in, say December or January, you could really start construction right that spring. In our case, we do have to wait for the loan closing, which really pushes us kind of into that August time period. So
I've got
locals-
a question also related to the, kind of a legal question. The process that you've laid out here for the revolving fund, I think I've got a reasonably good handle on, and we initiate that through a vote of council, and it's a responsibility of council to do that. And we also have, as a council, the authority to set water rates, which would include the repayment of this loan. We go the bonding route. Is that also authority of council, or does that require a vote of the electorate? Do we know?
typically, I don't know what typically what I've seen, it does have to go, there has to be some public notice for when the community sells bonds, but I don't know Grosse Pointe Park if that's specific.
Yeah, that's a question that we need to clarify legally, Nick, before we get too much further into this discussion. For example, well, most of the bonds that we've sold, we may, like the sewer separation, I believe that was a vote. However, in contrast to that, the City Hall renovation bond is being paid out of general revenue over a period of time, and did not require a millage increase, for example. And so that was under authority of council. I'm not really sure where this one falls, assuming that we would sell a bond and then pay it off through water bills. And I think that's a legal question we need clarification on.
Can I just follow up? Were you suggesting that we would get a better interest rate through this route than we would through the bonding?
It changed. We'd have to talk to our bond counsel, and because I haven't followed it very carefully over the last several months.
Sure.
But interest rates generally aren't coming down anymore, so if anything, they're creeping up. The low rate that was listed here is lower than we were able to get in December, and if anything, they've gone up. So I don't know the answer to that specifically. This appears to me to, assuming that these rates that will be applied, to be slightly better than we would get on the bond market. by the time we would float a bond, but I don't know that for a fact. I would think for purposes of financing costs, we might want to consider them as somewhat comparable. You know,
Then, from Patrick and Tom, do you, if we, I don't know if there was a sort of staggered, well, I just want to hear your feedback on the whole concept of sort of stretching this out, maybe doing a couple phases, something like that, rather than doing all the phases. So I'm just curious if you have any feedback on that.
Well, we know for a fact that lead service lines have to be done. There's no doubt about it. And at a rate that at 100 per year, that's still a lot to do, depending upon what contractor can handle it, or just one or more contractors. Again, even water main. I mean, as far back as I can remember, there's really not a lot of anything that was going on with infrastructure. And like the mayor just said that the biggest project we had done here was the sewer separation was very important. That's for sure. Definitely a heck of an impact financially on the city. And again, like you said, Mayor, 2018 was when we finally got done paying for that. Again, cities, other cities, Grosse Pointe City, Grosse Pointe Farms, Grosse Pointe Woods, even Grosse Pointe Shores, they're so far ahead of us when it comes to infrastructure, especially on the water end. I worked for Grosse Pointe City for 2.5 years, did the water main project there. That was all through capital improvement as far as that goes, which they do have money in there every year to do main replacement. But I mean, as far as this grant and everything else, I think it's something we can really look at, especially if you're talking lower interest rates too on top of it.
Do you want to explain your experience while you were in Grosse Pointe Woods with water main replacement and infrastructure?
Yeah, I would really like to. I really think that's something we really have to follow up on. We just can't keep kicking this can down the road. When I was in the woods, I spent 27 years there, and we replaced miles and miles of water main. It just, the money we recouped from it was astronomical, because we're losing water through leakage. We're losing water through bad meters. I mean, some of our meters in the park here are reading 20% lower than they should. And that's money that we're never going to get back. And we need to really follow up on this. The woods is, like Nino said, or Pat said, they're miles ahead of us. Every city is. We really need to get on board with this and somehow find, I know it sounds like a lot of money. I was on city council in Harper Woods. If it's something that's going to help everybody, which it will down the line, we're willing to pay for it. Everyone's willing to pay for something like this. You know, it's how we sell it and how we put it out there to everybody else. And that was my feeling towards when Pat first brought this whole idea. It's something we definitely have to really try to do. However we do it.
Thank you. No, I appreciate the urgency of it.
Yeah, there's a sort of a part two here too. Let's say we're able to execute the project plan exactly as it's been presented tonight. That doesn't replace all our water mains, nor does it replace 100% of our lead service lines.
Yeah.
The lead service line portion of it is essentially an unfunded mandate by the state, which we'll have to complete at some point. And I think they'll be still scattered, not as concentrated as in these first 4 phases, but scattered. We estimate somewhere on the order of 800 additional lead service lines that would have to be replaced over the remaining period of time. So there will be some additional cost beyond this project just for the lead service lines. And there, you can't like reinvent all the infrastructure of a city all at once. It's just it's a project that we couldn't do. But that's an important one to keep in mind, because it's an unfunded mandate and there is a endpoint on what would be those additional 800
Sure.
lines.
Councilmember McConnell, I don't want to interrupt you if you're
I have
done.
one last question.
Okay.
I promise. The only other thing I just wanted, it's not even a question really, but just to raise the concept of, if there's any parts of the budget we can look to find some additional funds that could support this work, so that we can avoid, putting the burden on the taxpayer. So I just have to raise the issue so that we can think about it. I'm certainly willing to spend time going line by line and seeing what we can find. So.
And one of the things I'll add to that, Councilmember McConnell, just for everyone's note, the average replacement for a lead service line, you're looking at roughly about.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, please. What was that? It's about $6,000 per lead service line replacement. And so something that Patrick and Pat Thomas and Tom Jenny we've discussed is that moving forward as part of our city budget, we might have to set aside some capital improvement monies, that addresses each year, just takes off a little bit in the lead service line. We did discuss as a council that we did have quite an aggressive, capital improvements this year, just due to some, things that we had kicked down a little bit more, but we were going to try and tamp that down a little bit. So that's certainly an area moving forward that the city has been looking at, for the potential of continuing that program. One thing I do want to say as well is that, Patrick and Krista had discussed that, principal forgiveness is something that, certainly communities are hopeful for, and that could be an avenue that certainly helps in that cost as well. From my understanding, and Patrick or Krista, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you do not spend the full $27 million, you are not obligated to pay for the full 27 million. So if we say, let's say we save 3 or 4 million off of that, we're not charged that. Is that correct?
I think that 27 million is, of the loans that they take out at the state level, that's your portion. If you don't use it, I guess that would basically just, go towards the principal, so that, 27 million, if you don't use $1 million, it, knocks $1 million off that. So, but typically you want that estimate to be, good, but you have a little bit of a contingency on it. I think all the projects have, basically some of that built into it. But then ultimately it's going to be about what you actually bid out. So the bid will be what gets turned in when they go do that closing for the loan. And we typically use is called unit price bidding. So we know how many feet of water main is going to go in as part of the project. And we'll be managing that throughout. So if there's, if we do end up not using maybe as much main in a certain area, that cost would come down accordingly. Usually it comes pretty close to that at the end, though, we find.
We built in about a 10 to 15% contingency.
Yep, they have a standard contingency we have to kind of carry for basically, you kind of call it the design and legal costs that typically can be included in these. We don't really see a lot of that in this particular project. We do have to do a rate methodology through the process. Design, of course, is part of it. But, in some cases, say you're building a new water treatment plant, you actually have to acquire land and easements and that kind of thing. Our work is going to be, with the exception of the lead service lines, all within city right away. So we don't anticipate the need to really acquire land as part of the project.
Thanks, Patrick.
I had a couple of questions. One is, what does it typically cost us? Just when we have a main break unexpectedly, what does that typically cost us?
As far as water main breaks, depending upon where it's at. As far as that goes, like on Mack Avenue, if we were to have one on Mack, with that being in Mack Avenue, again, the impact on most of the businesses and such, as far as that goes, depending upon if we can get the main shut down properly, isolated in a good area. The valves being so bad, sometimes you got to go back the street. So then you got residents included on that. So basically, as far as the typical amount that it's going to cost, once you do the break, everything else, usually on Mack Avenue, we require 4 people. It's a OSHA rule also, along with cones and everything else. Typically takes anywhere from 6 to 10 hours. So you're talking about manual labor, everything else on that, cleanup, repair of the street, backfill of 21AA. You're looking at probably anywhere between $7,000 to about $9,000.
Okay, thank you. And then the other question I had was, one of the slides indicated that, you know, without replacing the meters, we're not getting proper reading on the amount of water that's being used. So one thing we just need to keep in mind in terms of just informing residents is that it sounds to me like their water bills are going to go up as well.
Yeah, very true. On something like that, again, when meters, like Jenny was saying, when the meters are only reading at 85%, I mean, the city is actually losing money. I mean, right now,
Right.
They're pretty aggressive right now on replacing a lot of the meters right now. We had a real good deal early on from one of the contractors, and we were capable of getting meters, and they're doing pretty well with that. That will cut the cost down a little bit too, also, if we get into this project. And when they go to replace the lead service lines, they're going to find a brand new meter there. There's a cost that we don't have to worry about. And again, like I said, with the meters running at anywhere from 85, some of them will run, 100%. But if you're talking like a toilet leak or another leak or something like that, you get zero reading whatsoever. That's money, as they say, going down the drain.
So
But
that
yeah,
a more accurate meter saves the city money, but it costs the residents because now they're actually paying for the correct amount of water that they're using.
exactly.
Okay.
And what can happen too in that case is that the residents with the more accurate meters, just because there's a cost to acquire water from GLWA, and as well as the operational costs that the city tracks on an annual basis, that cost just gets spread out. And so what may happen is that, if you have certain homes with very slow meters and some that are more accurate, it can disproportionately assess those costs for the folks with the more accurate meters because it assumes they're using more water, and it may not be the case. So having a system with, consistently operable, accurately reporting water meters is just going to make sure that everyone's really paying their fair share for how much water they're using.
Right.
The other thing I keep in mind on flow rates is that over time, GWA, Great Lakes Water, has moved a lot of their costs from flow rate to fixed. And while it's absolutely true that our more accurate meters will give us better reads and therefore more accurate revenue collection, as a percentage of the bill, it's not as large a percentage of the bill as it was, say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, that was a significant component of everybody's bill. Today, it's still obviously an important component, but has diminished in its percent. I don't know exactly what, but as Great Lakes Water has moved cost from variable to fixed. The other question I've got as we're thinking about cost and other charges is that assuming that the federal relief money comes in as anticipated, we're expecting a little over $1 million to Grosse Pointe Park. Some of that has to be done for obviously used for purposes other than underground infrastructure, but some of it could be applied to water infrastructure. Let's say, I don't know, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, something we probably could count on applying. Nick, has the city thought about what the priorities would be when that money comes in? Would it be to begin phase one essentially, or would it be to pick up some of the things that are left out? Or have we thought about how we might apply that money?
Yeah, so speaking with the Dwarf project, our first priority was phase one, which is that Weyburn and Maryland and Mack Avenue area. Our initial strategy and thought was that, if we were to apply for Dwarf, or we ended up going out for a bond and we identify those areas of lead service line and water main replacement, we could use those funds for the other areas of the community that aren't as much of a concentration. So that's why Patrick and his team, had those different areas, because that was the highest concentration of main breaks and lead service lines that we could tackle all at once. With the 1.1 million, what we would consider doing is potentially looking at those areas of the community that, there's not as much concentration of a lead service line. So I did the math. Approximately, you're looking at, I think if we did $800,000 of lead service line, if we use that 1.1 million, you're looking at about 133 lead service lines that would be replaced from that $800,000. So that certainly will help us move the goalpost a little bit further for our strategy. Ultimately, this is very aggressive, probably the most aggressive approach that we can take. However, I think it's something, as you've heard from my colleagues here, that, we've kicked that can. We need to certainly see what we can do, and whether that's through dwarf or bonding, and then obviously a little bit of help from the American Rescue Plan. One thing I did see, and I'm glad Patrick brought it up, and I'll bring it up to council and the public, is that, certainly talking with our elected officials, seeing if they can certainly help, in our application process, going to the federal government as well, for earmarks, working with Senator Stabenow or Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence is something that's going to be very important. So those are areas that, we're going to try and move forward. I know I went off the rail a little bit, but that's my answer.
Can I just, so we're not restricted to using the rescue fund dollars for projects that are specific outcomes due to COVID. I know infrastructure was on there. I know I've been feeling pretty confident about this, but someone else has made me second guess it a little bit. So I just want to make sure that that's okay for us to use those dollars for that kind of work. And then when you said the 133 lines replaced, that would also include the water main or any of those related infrastructure replacements at the same time, or no?
That would only be lead service lines. It's average about $6,000 to replace just a lead service line per home.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, to follow up on that. So, but we're saying after we've spent the 27 million, we will be left with about 800 additional lead service lines that we still need to replace.
That's correct.
And at 6,000 each, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so I feel like possibly not by the special meeting on June 28th, but we also need a plan for how and when we're going to get the rest of those lines replaced.
Right, I agree with you, Councilmember Flew, and that's something OHM and DPW and I have discussed, is that if we went ahead with the program, Patrick, we're looking at, after 5 years, we've essentially addressed 60% of the lead service lines within Grosse Pointe Park. So if we were to complete that by 2025, 26, Patrick, with the years of the 20 years, we still have roughly about 15 years.
15, yep.
15 years to address those other 883 lead service lines, that whether we do some of that through the American Rescue Plan funding, or that we set aside in our capital improvements line item, addressing every year. And then obviously as well, looking for any opportunities, through federal grants or, earmarks in that area. So I agree with you, Councilmember Fluid. This is something, we definitely need to address, but we're right now kind of at the start. And as we continue, and if this moves forward, then they'll be able to help us move the needle a little further for addressing this issue.
Right. I know that's something, I understand we need to do this first, but I think we need to be able to tell people what we're looking at for those other 800 lines shortly thereafter. Something
Agreed.
something the mayor had mentioned was, I think, what we talked about last summer when we first discussed this, and I think we were all in agreement. And of course, Councilmember McConnell wasn't there at that time, but we all kind of agreed, regardless of the amount of time we have to do this, nobody's going to want to wait 15 years to get their lead line replaced. So we can do this first, but we do need to, if my math is correct, that's another 4.8 million. Nobody's going to wait 5 or 10 or 15 years. We're going to have to devise a plan to deal with that, very shortly after we devise the plan to deal with the water mains.
Agreed.
And none of this precludes work on additional grants and funding sources. You know, I think there's always the possibility to get some grant money. Remember, this is actually a financing vehicle, the revolving fund. There's an element of grant to it because of the low interest rate, but it's essentially a financing vehicle. There are potentially other sources of grant funding that will help us accomplish some of what you just described. And I agree with you, Councilmember Fluid. We need that plan just because we're faced with. Now, on the flip side of that, I would remind us all that we are enjoying high quality drinking water, and although we have lead service lines, there's no evidence that they are presenting a health hazard at the present time, and that has a lot to do with the quality of the water and the water treatment that Great Lakes Water provides to us. So the fact that Great Lakes Water has a high quality track record, is treating it for to avoid corrosion, does leave us with a safe system, even for those that are going to take longer for us to get to. So what I don't want to do is create some sort of alarm in the community that, you know, if you're not in the first phase, somehow your drinking water is not safe. That's really not the case. What we're trying to do is head off a problem that could occur down the road.
And also just, we just got our lead test back from, for 2020. And actually, believe it or not, it's no longer 9, it's actually 4 parts per billion, which is a lot lower than last year's.
That's good news.
Is there any other questions regarding this? I know there's quite a bit, there was a lot of great comments and questions for Patrick and Krista.
And we've been at this a good long time. We may have worn everybody out, but Councilmembers McConnell and Fluid, do you have anything more? Or, I think, or are we good for now? I know I'm good for now.
I think I'm good for now. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm good. Thanks. Thank you to our presenters.
Yeah, that was there's a lot of work that went into this. Obviously, we contracted for this work, but a lot of work, a lot of necessary work, and the quality I think is very high. So I appreciate that from all concerned. With that, we're going to move on to next agenda item, new and old business. Does any member on the committee have something in the category of new or old business they wanted to bring up or mention?
I just would think it would be good to, I asked about this at last night's council meeting, but I don't think we got a chance to complete the conversation, to just talk about the plan for alley maintenance. And then, yeah, can you speak to that, Nick?
Yeah, so Patrick's been working with us right now, and with Pat Thomas and Tom Jenny, identifying those alleys that are in need of desperate repair. You know, I can say, you know, with confidence that quite a bit of them, or almost all of them, need to have some repair. They've identified a couple right now, and they are in the process of getting those bids out to see what those prices would be for the alley work. We're hopeful that there could be a potential we could use some TIFA dollars within the TIFA district as well. We do have our road monies that can be used for the alleys. And then going off topic from the alleys a little bit, we already did agree to a Patterson Park parking lot replacement that we got a very favorable price on Patterson Park repaving. And then, as well as Patrick showed in his Paiser rating map, we have already went out to the contractor and are waiting prices regarding a couple streets that we'd like to identify. So roughly within the road budget this year, we have just a tad over $400,000. So not as much as what we had in years prior to, but we want to try and obviously address those areas that, especially alleys, have never been addressed in previous years. The previous road millage that Grosse Pointe Park voters passed did not allow for language to identify and, fix those alleys. And that's something that I know I've heard from many residents as well as council members and Tifa members that we need to finally address those, and we're looking to do so.
And then just to follow up on that, you also spoke to code enforcement a little bit, I think at the TIPA meeting, and residents have some pretty cool ideas about some other things that as it relates to alleys that I'll share with you. I won't go through all of them now, but I just want, for example, one talked about perhaps stop signs depending on where the alley is located, because there can be some hazards there. But another talked about, something artistic to sort of gussy up the alley. So I'll pass along all the resident ideas.
Okay.
Sounds good. Anything else on new and old business? Okay, seeing none, I think this committee can be adjourned.
I'm sorry, Mayor. I lost connection there for just a second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Councilmember McConnell was finishing up what she was saying, and I just got back in. I did have one more question, which was to ask Pat Thomas a follow-up question about the water testing. Where do we take those samples when we do annual water testing?
Well, samples are given to the residents. Actually, we picked out 30 different residents that do have lead service lines at their homes. Great Lakes Water Authority requires us to take the same samples from the same homes. I think, Tom, Jenny, did we have any different addresses we had to go to this time?
We had two more. We
Lost a couple?
we lost a couple just with the houses are gone. And we also, people had replaced their lines themselves. So, but we have a list of over 100 people. And so we're allowed to pick a couple extra ones here and there. And we did that this year, but everyone's starting to bring them back right now. We've got all the bottles out. I think we've gotten 5 or 8 samples back already. So, and they'll go out to a testing facility out in Livonia this time.
And how many, Tom, before we used to have 5, all we had to do was 5 sites is all we had to test from years ago. And ever since Flint, they bumped that right up to 30.
Yes. Yes, it's 30.
Community population. Yep.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, all right, thank you. I didn't know how that worked.
Yeah, they're on top of it.
Okay, thanks. That's good. I remember when we only had to do 5.
Yeah.
I was always worried if we had an outlier, what that might mean.
Right.
Any other new and old business? Okay, with that, I think we can move to adjourn. Committee members, you agree to adjournment of the meeting?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And with that, as chair, I will adjourn the Public Service Committee and thank everybody for the participation. Really a productive meeting. A lot of information. We're probably tired of thinking about it right now, so take a deep breath and move on. So thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks.
Thank you,
guys.
everyone, too.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.